Thank you, Pastor Dave Mueller, for agreeing to do this. We appreciate it. And the reason we want to talk to you today, well, there are many reasons, and we have many questions for you, many more than this brief episode can contain. But you've had a tenure in ministry. You have followed a call from our Lord for half a century. And before that, you were in ministry too. You may not have been ordained yet, but you had a ministerial bent of mind, most likely. That doesn't happen on the day of ordination. And long after you retire, if you ever finally successfully do so, you have tried and tried, you will still be ministering in a very real way. So I think it would be great just to talk with you a little bit about your 50 years in ministry, some of what you've learned, some of what you hope we will learn, and just give folks a taste of a very rare breed. You know, the ministry is a hard place to be, and it's also a wonderful place to be. But there aren't a lot of ministers or anyone in pastoral roles who make it to 50 years. The turnover rate is high, and I won't get into the statistics, and the departure from single churches is quite a ready clip. You've also had endurance at individual congregations, which is also uncommon. But we wanted to just talk with you about your experiences, your perspective, your understanding of God, in order to pass on a little bit of what you've learned to whoever will watch this in the future. So thank you. And I thought it might be great to start, and you can decide how much you want to say, but it'd be great to start with how Christ caught your heart, how he got your attention, and how you decided, yeah, that's where I want to invest my life's work. That's where I want to put my energy, my talent, my gift. And if you're ready to talk about, how you sensed God's call and how you knew that was him and you were going to say, yeah, I'm going there. That's a long question. It's a little lead in, a little set the table, but I promise not to do much more talking.
I think it has to be said that on my father's side, my father was not a pastor, but his brother was, and there are literally scores of pastors from my great-grandfather on my father's side. He was the first to be ordained by a denomination in this country. And his mandate was, if you're a male, you'll be ordained, and if you're female, you'll marry one. And a lot of them did. It's utterly amazing. A family tree has been done on that side, and how many thousands of years get collected in terms of their ministries. And I cherish the obituary I have of him and his ministry and how he functioned in ministry. I still have it. I wasn't around then, but I still have a copy of it. So I think that it can rightfully be said that on my father's side, it was you will believe. On my mother's side, who came from a different Christian perspective, it's you will behave. And at some level, my dad won that one. It's not that I was massively misbehaviored, but I thought, at least a little, the notion that I had to fall into some kind of a category of behavior that I wasn't prepared to live out. Both my parents were Christians and spiritual, and it was evident in, I think, more subtle than overt ways as I was growing up. It wasn't like, we went to church every Sunday night or anything. We were always in church when church was held. And indeed, my one uncle and my grandfather were pastors of the church that I grew up in at one time outside Pittsburgh. So there were many people, including non-relatives, it actually spooked me when I was growing up, who said, "You're going to be a pastor. You're going to be a pastor." And I would, under my breath, say, "No, not that. I don't want to do that." And to make a long story short, there are two episodes in my life as a kid that I count as significant elements in my call into the ministry. One is when I was about 8 or 9, I was standing in a children's Christmas program right next to the pulpit at my home church. Please understand that in those days, children didn't come to the altar. When parents would take communion, they'd leave their kids with each other while they came up. Nowadays, everybody comes up for a blessing and so forth, and that's fine. But in those days, you didn't do that. Kids didn't get near the altar. That was the Holy of Holies. And I was standing next to that pulpit. I had this incredibly strange sensation come over me. And it was a sensation of belonging. Some years later, a few, I was in junior high. I went to the movie theater in my hometown with somebody else. I don't even remember who I was with. One other friend. And when I came out, there were 4 or 5 high school students, older and bigger than I was, who were battering this fellow in my hometown who was slow. That's what we called it in those days. He was slow. And there weren't any services for this man. You know, they didn't have daycare centers for adults and that kind of thing in those days. We're talking the 50s and 60s. So I wanted to go into the phone booth and change my clothes and become Superman and teach those high schoolers a lesson. It engendered both compassion and a bit of rage in me. But it also caused a question. And that is, what can Dave Mueller do for people like this fella? Not just because he was slow, but because he was being abused. What can I do? Now look, one of those experiences was inside the church, indeed at the sanctuary. The other experience was in the street. If I were to sum up my own ministry, at least what I hope was my own ministry, there has been a balance between ministry in the church and in the congregation and ministry in the streets of one kind or another. I would never let the one abuse the other or hamper the other. And I never had anybody complaining in the congregation that I was too busy in the streets. And so it sort of worked out. So I have had just absolutely incredible experiences in both those regards. I can say more about that in another context. But for now, that did not at the time lead me to say I'm going to be a pastor when I grow up. What it took to do that is I went to a Lutheran university. And I didn't know why. I just felt that that's what a person growing up in a family like mine was supposed to do. It had nothing to do with going into the ministry. It was a university. It wasn't a school for a Bible school or something. And I honestly believed, this is not a joke, I honestly believed that when I got there, I was going to be given a monk's cowl. I was going to spend the next 4 years in some kind of quasi-monastic environment. I mean, I believe that. You didn't go visit these places when I was a kid. It was too expensive. You just got accepted and went. I was accepted at one other school and I didn't go there. But in any event, and I found out 2 minutes after getting there that was not necessary. And at Valparaiso University, by the way, one of the things that they pride themselves in and have won awards on historically is a balance between strong academic environment and character development. And so much of that character development in the context of that university was take what you're learning here in whatever course and learn to apply it in your real life as a Christian. And so, that was what was happening to me along the way. Now, let me stop for a minute and ask another question so I can stop talking here for a minute, because I got something else to say about the call.
Okay, and that might include your encounter with Christ, or your decision, if it was a decision, or if it was just a realization, or if it was just something that drew you to him as opposed to anywhere else you might have been drawn. Perhaps that was your training as a child, and you didn't, I don't know. That's something else.
Well, it was. I can't pinpoint a moment in my life where I made a decision or that I had an epiphany of some enlightened kind per se. But I had experiences, and I think it's fair to say I was open to those experiences. I was never close-hearted about things of the Spirit and so forth. So
a lot happens in 50 years, and some of it is wonderful, and I hope it outweighs everything that's difficult. But there are many difficult times, and I'm wondering if you could talk about a story or perhaps some incident where you saw God at work in an unexpected way, or in a either in a great triumph or helping someone prevail through a great difficulty.
My problem is going to be picking one. Let me just say this, and I really believe this is probably expected of me in one sense. I think most clergy would at least mouth these words, and I would hope believe them. But we get to participate in the lives of people at the heights of their celebrations and at the depths of their struggles, and at a whole lot of in-betweens. And there have been, it has been unbelievable. I was just yesterday at a memorial luncheon, is the best thing I could call it, for a member of the Church of Concordia that I served for 30 years. And I've been gone for that for 15 years, but I still have relationships. And this man's children, who are in their late 50s and 60s now, were teenagers when I was there. And just the stories that unfold and this sort of unsolicited affirmation of the relationships that were there over the years. It's just incredible. It's just incredible. One thing that comes to mind, and it's kind of along the lines there, is I had a fellow show up at church, a young guy. He was a mess. He was just a mess, and his wife had just left him, and they had not been married that long, and he was a mess. And it's okay to have a mess and be in church. And so, we chatted and did this, that, and the other thing, and talked it over. So with nothing formal, but one night he called me, at least marginally suicidal. And I went to his home, and he was really inebriated, all right? And that was not something that he had problem with historically. He just had it, and in that inebriated state, though, he was ready to waste himself and so forth. And I was smart enough and experienced enough in those days that I was going to try to do anything while I was in that state. So I went to Wawa and got a gallon of coffee and walked up and down the street with him for a couple of hours. It was 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning until he got marginally sober. And then we could talk. And he simply got through that. And I was honored to do his marriage ceremony with another woman sometime later. It wasn't immediate or anything like that. And they moved out of town, not all that far, but I was invited to do the baptism of their children. When you think about the way that started and then the way it ended, and I can name scores of stories like that. And, to go back to the fellow in the street that was being battered, I finally learned, and it kind of evolved. It wasn't, again, an epiphany. I got it. It just evolved. You know what? This fellow that I was watching being battered, and it really touched my heart. What can I do for him? I couldn't beat the other guys up and wasn't inclined to do that either. He was a really strange person. There was no place to send him to get some kind of help, this kind of thing. But you know what? He used to sit on the tailor shop stoop in my hometown, and it was a railroad town. And across this creek was, during World War II, the largest railroad center in the world, outside Pittsburgh. And it was named after Robert Pitcairn, who was one of the Pennsylvania Railroad barons, the town of Pitcairn was. And he would sit there for hours on that stoop and watch the trains go by. And I don't remember anybody looking at him and saying, "Hi, John," or whatever his name was, or him waving at anybody else. His movements were so slow. And again, that's what we called them in those days. But I decided that what you could do for a person like him was to sit on the steps, be his friend. And when I got to thinking about it, that's what the ministry is. It may be in a hospital room, it may be in a prison, and I've been there. It may be in the street, it may be in a living room, it may be at a kitchen table, it may be in a bar someplace, and I've had that happen. But I am sitting and being a friend. There may be words. I oft quote Mother Teresa, who herself was quoting St. Francis when she said, "It's our duty to share the gospel, and sometimes we use words." But all the words in the world would not help if you're not willing to spend some time on the stoop with people. And that's outside, not inside. That's not preaching. That's not teaching a class. That's not leading a workshop for leadership or something like that. That's just being out there, sitting with people and being their friends. And how about the song, "What a Friend We Have in Jesus"?
Wow, that is, how many of us have been that person on the stoop wishing somebody would just come up and be there and listen. Care. Thank you. That was awesome. That was awesome. So, tough times, you've had them in over 50 years, and you have a certain bent of mind to get through tough times. You have certain things perhaps that you bring to mind, some things that you reflect on or you remember or you listen to or something. Could you share some of the disciplines or some of the ways that you keep going when others might say, I'm done, or I'm out of here, or this isn't what I signed up for, or whatever?
Yeah. Perhaps a rather large example is in Toledo. We have very limited space. The Lutherans have this problem. We build sanctuaries first, and later build an addition that's got Sunday school rooms in it. Other churches have learned, no, you build the educational stuff and worship in there and teach in there and all that, and build your church later. We never learned that. But anyway, we decided to add on. And I had a lot of craftsmen in that congregation, and we built it ourselves. I was just out there a while back for the 50th anniversary of that congregation. The building is still standing. We built it for just a little bit more than the average cost of a home in that community. Was, I forget how large. It had 6 classrooms, a kitchen, a couple bathrooms, and a fellowship area in the middle. I mean, it wasn't a little add-on, all right? But once one is through a building program, you learn a whole lot of things. And so all of a sudden I get to a congregation, and I was called to Concordia to direct a contact program, a 24-hour hotline that they had started. And I was coming out of the University of Virginia Medical Center after a clinical residency there. And in many ways, it was really an ideal call for me because I primarily got to work in my newly gained specialty, which was sort of crisis intervention and all the stuff that the hotline had. But at the same time, have some kind of parish involvement. And so I was in my glory at some level. And you know what? Being on the phone with people in a crisis is kind of like sitting on the steps with them, by the way. And so I was able to make that connection as well. But Concordia decided then to reactivate their building program. They had bought the property years earlier and never built it. And I started by saying, let's put a sign up out there that doesn't say we're coming, but come and rejoice with us and give our present address, this kind of thing, on this land. Well, finally, the building committee got constituted and it was ready to get started. I stayed as much out of that as I could because A, it was their congregation, not mine. B, they were paying far more than I was paying for it, although I paid something, all right? C, they knew better than I did about all kinds of things, all right? And D, I didn't want to deal with another building program. So I essentially let that go. Now, I inserted myself every now and then, primarily around issues liturgical, appointments about altars and pulpits and that kind of thing. But other than that, I stayed away. And you know what? There are ways in terms of the whole of the ministry where you just need to cut lay people loose. Now, that doesn't mean you don't come to the meetings or don't thank them for doing what they do or any of those kind of things. It simply means I don't have to have my thumb on everything that happens in the church. I just don't. I haven't. I had an associate for a while. That's its own issue. We don't need to get into that. But one of the things I used to say to him is trust God's people. If they make mistakes, they'll be forgiven. And you can't keep them from making every mistake that they're going to make. So, look, I learned early on how to handle myself in a spiritual sense with my own prayer life and study. And I think, again, I'll call up that balance between being in the congregation and being in the real world. It was Wesley who once said, the world is my parish, and you're really in trouble when the parish becomes your world. And there are a lot of clergy who don't get outside of the parameters of their own specific responsibilities. And I have had wonderful opportunities in that world out there. And let me say one more thing about that. I celebrate in its fullness the people that the Lord has put in my life. And especially, but not exclusively, colleagues. I have had amazing collegiality with people and pastors and rabbis, as you know. And when you're with them and can be honest with them and them with you about what's going on in your various settings and so forth and so on, that can be incredibly helpful. And there's all kinds of things in that world out there that you can get done when you work with others.
Well, thank you. That was helpful. And, you have a wonderful gift, too, for you're a student of history, clearly, and you draw in a lot of that in your sermons. You draw in humor, some of it kind of weird humor, but it's humor. It keeps your attention, and it keeps people engaged. And you have a good bent of mind for intersecting with other people's brains. I'm wondering, you also, it takes humility to collaborate. It takes humility to cross boundary lines that have long been, and you mentioned that this morning, the different divisions in many different religions as well. Christianity is divided sharply in many ways, and in some ways Christianity has been weaponized probably in some people's minds. So I'm wondering what you would say to the church, the greater church, about reclaiming the joy of our salvation and demonstrating the love that John says will show whether we are Jesus followers or not. That's a tall question. That could take 50 years probably just to get a handle on. But I wonder if you could share a little, maybe a bit of advice for the church beyond St. Mark's, beyond any of the congregations you serve, and maybe share a little bit about why you have hope for the church.
Yeah. We celebrated the 450th anniversary of the Augsburg Confession here in town. It was primarily, but not exclusively, a Lutheran event. Actually, as I recall, we had some Roman Catholics involved. And you could start to do that with Roman Catholics and Lutherans and some other Christians. After a while, some of the animus that had been there historically waned. And I think for good reasons it waned. You know, we needed to learn to work together and to minister together and to... But anyway, I invented a phrase that went into the paperwork that people got when they came, the brochure. And that is, no Christian celebrates what separates. All right? Now, hold on to that for a minute. Because you kind of have that as a grounding as a Christian. Is whatever it is that separates, whether it's churches or whether it's in a marriage or whether it's in a community, whatever, racial, whatever separation, whatever causes people to be, pushed out. That's just wrong. It's sinful. God doesn't want us to be that way. So whatever pulls us together is essentially good. So you don't celebrate this. You celebrate this. And we Christians, of course, have Jesus to celebrate with each other to begin with. We don't have Jesus to celebrate with some other entities out there. So keep that in mind. Now, on the other hand, I read a book here maybe about 2 years ago. I'd bought it earlier, but it was so thick that I just needed to be in the right place to read it. And it was entitled The Unintended Effects of the Reformation by a Catholic scholar from Notre Dame called Brad Gregory. He is a historian. And one of the things he said, it struck me, this is a very complex book, and he has a smaller one. It's about Luther, Radical in Our Midst, I think it's called, which lay people could much better read and appreciate some church history, and especially since the Reformation. But this was written for gatekeepers and people who really wanted to dig into the Reformation. One of the things that he said, and by the way, he had a 30-page introduction. It must have taken me 3 weeks to read. I mean, he was really, really complex. But once I got the rhythm of his thinking and so forth and so on, I could read on. Anyway, he said, in Western church, the Roman Church had problems and corruption and inefficiencies and any number of other things. But essentially, it had unity with the Pope. All right? Maybe a strange unity to Protestants, but nevertheless a unity. The rebellions and so forth were kept in check, and there were mechanisms for dealing with them that they didn't cause the church further grief. Well, when the Reformation hit, we took the Bible and said, we don't need a pope, we got Scripture, and on Scripture I stand, Luther would say, and so forth. But the problem is that one group of Christians took this portion of Scripture, and another group of Christians took this portion of Scripture, and yet another group of Christians. And all of a sudden, instead of even this shaky unity, you had complete fragmentation. And that's gone on ever since. And there have been times in this country where one denomination was preaching against another and so forth and so on. And the biggest of those controversies is the one that happened at the end of the 1800s into the 1900s with the modernist fundamentalist division. And that's the one that's still with us in so many ways. The crossing that sort of zone between North Korea and South Korea is a little bit what that is like. And it's gotten deeper and worse in so many ways, politically and theologically and in terms of certain issues of theology and so forth. Well, that's the way it is, but I can't celebrate it. I have to look for opportunities to bridge that gap. I can't write anybody off. I don't believe God is. I don't think my side is righteous and another side isn't. So I have to be kind of ready to celebrate some kind of movement, if you will. And as you said, it isn't easy. And it's a demilitarized zone in there. And I believe very strongly that one of the things happening in this country, and there are counterparts in other countries, except in Africa and Asia, where the church is growing abundantly, we need each other. We really can't afford to lob theological or spiritual stones at each other anymore. And if we're going to not only survive but thrive in America and not become Europe, where cathedrals are museums and so forth and so on, and if anybody's in church, they got cobwebs all over them, we don't want to become that. Then we've got to learn to work together. And we got to listen to each other and see what's important and where we differ and where we hold similarities. And you know what? That can be done also with any other faiths. My faith, my Christian faith, does not teach me anywhere that I can find to hate anybody or to write anybody off or to call somebody evil. And quite frankly, it's not my job to castigate them into hell. That's way above my pay grade. I accept that boundary. I'm glad God has it and I don't, to tell you the truth. And in the meantime, I got to do my best to function with love and with grace. That's not me, that's God. And mercy with anybody I encounter.
Thank you, Lord. Listen, you have been through 50 years of interaction with congregations. I hope you have experienced encouragement and support from them, but I happen to know that often families of pastors and pastors themselves are subjected to extraordinary expectations and maybe, an extraordinary level of criticism and objective difficulty. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this will be my last question to you, what has been an encouragement to you? What has helped give you traction in your ministry? What we as a congregation at St. Mark's and anyone else here who cares about their pastor and his or her family and their well-being might take to mind and might take to heart as they engage with that person and hopefully follow with them through, we hope, decades of ministry, which you have done in one congregation, 30 years.
And we weren't without our crises, and I'm not going to get into them, but one event that really stands out in terms of affirmation and support it is an unfortunate reality that my wife and I, after 13 years, divorced. And I was very sensitive to how that would impact upon congregations. You know, there are a lot of marriages out there that are fragile and vulnerable. And gee whiz, if the pastor can do it, maybe I didn't want to become the agent of marriages breaking up. And so I was very cautious and was certainly willing to bow to my ecclesiastical authorities. And I got lots of support on that end from the district president and other people in authority over me. And I was willing to bow to that. And I got counsel from them along the way and so forth and so on. And Concordia didn't like what happened to us, that was for sure. I hadn't been there that long, actually. I was called as pastor as recently as less than a year. I was in that other position for 2 years first. But you know what? To just make a long story short, when Gigi and I remarried in this very aisle that we're sitting in 5 years later, when I announced that we were, the way I said it was the first Mrs. Mueller is going to be Mrs. Mueller again, is they threw hymnals in the air like his graduation at Annapolis and did all kinds of things. And this room was as filled as it's ever been. And we even invited the family court judge who divorced us. And he came. Didn't have much opportunity to do that kind of a thing. And I can, in good conscience, say, I could not have scripted any better the way Concordia handled that whole thing. And I don't just mean the way it turned out. I mean along the way. They were sensitive to me. They were supportive, patient, that kind of thing. So I celebrate that moment. When it comes to those critical moments where there's arguments going on or some kind of conflict with me, hey, by the way, there's always going to be people in a congregation with whom you have conflict. It's just inevitable, some number of them, hopefully small number. I really believe that to some level, the people who really admire you are harder to manage because if you ever fail them, and we're human. You know, we confess the sins when they do. And if you set yourself up as in any way, Beth, above them or better than them or holier than them or whatever else, you're in for trouble because you're not. And you are, if you're with them, if you're sitting in the pews with them, even if you're standing up there, if you're sitting in the pews with them while you're listening to yourself and you're listening to your God, who is trying to tell all of you something that can benefit you. Now, you have to be pretty thick-skinned at times. But, my first parish, I don't know how to say this, but I couldn't have cut my teeth on a harder, more difficult context. These were all auto workers and transmission specialists and glass workers. This was Toledo, Ohio, for Pete's sake. I think I had one teacher and one engineer, and everybody else worked for Libby Owens Ford or someplace like that. And they were tough. And this one lady, she comes to me. I grew a beard. I've had a beard of one kind or another for 50 years, all 50 years. She said to me, I don't like your beard. And this was a person with whom I didn't have the greatest of relationships. I have to be truthful. This was a Sunday morning before church. I was in my vestments. I looked at her and I said, you know what? I don't like your dress. And we sort of both laughed. and that engagement, if I'd have felt sorry for myself and not been able to function that Sunday, what good would it have done? So I figured this is a little bit of vengeance and maybe it'll clear things up. And we could laugh about that one all the way along. And you have to laugh in this business. You have to laugh. You do plenty of crying, but you have to laugh. And I think Jesus is funny. I think Jesus said some things that are really hilarious. And I'm not going to get into all that now. You might think they're weird, but I think they're funny. So we can laugh together. I think there's a congregation, charismatic congregations I remember up in Toronto that people would travel to have the Toronto experience. And all they did was go up there and laugh. They got together and laughed. And I never really understood how they could do that and how you could just do nothing but laugh. But evidently it was renewing for them. So I don't need to go to Toronto to laugh. We laugh here and rejoice here and be glad here and celebrate here and so forth. So.
Thank you very much for taking this time. There's a banner back there that says, "Serve the Lord with gladness." I think you have done that here in spite of being in retirement and a global pandemic. And I know I speak for everyone at St. Mark's and far beyond to say thank you for ministering with us, for being in the trenches with us, for caring about us through thick and thin, for sticking it out when you could have been in your cabin or wherever else you wanted to be. And thank you so much to you and your family, and we love you, and we ask God's blessing on your next 50.
Well, hey, thank you. And, we sort of got the whole congregation, and that's what congregations are sort of like when they're without their own pastor, to sit on the stoop with each other a little bit and be friends. And that worked. I think it's worked. Yeah.